Greetings, mortals, and welcome to this video on designing difficulty.
So this video is going to be a little bit about how to actually make a difficult encounter. What's the difference between a difficult encounter, a bullshit encounter, a punishing encounter, and a limiting encounter? Because those are all four different dynamics that are tangentially related to difficulty, but are not difficulty. So difficulty is how much technical or strategic skill is necessary in order to, how much you need to learn before you can complete the encounter. Okay, so if you want to succeed, how much do you have to learn either in terms of physical prowess or intellectual prowess or strategic prowess? How clever do you need to be? How quick do your reflexes need to be? How much do you need to learn to complete the encounter? That is difficulty. Bullshittery is how likely is the encounter to just kill you with no way of preventing it. So an example, I'll go into the examples later, but bullshittery is basically just, oh, well, the enemy rolled a natural 20, and then it rolled another natural 20, and then it rolled another natural 20, and so that's a Vorpal effect, so you die instantly because it rolled very well. Okay, so like if you look at homebrew extended critical tables, Vorpal effects are a great example of bullshittery. They don't increase difficulty because there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, so that's bullshittery. Which is just RNG kills. Then there's limiting of scope. Now, anytime you make something harder, you're fundamentally limiting the options that the player has at their disposal that will successfully deal with the problem at hand. You start out with a suite of options. You have all of these abilities. You have all of these different ways that you can use them. And some of them will be effective and some of them will not. And limiting the scope of the encounter to, okay, you have to use this ability or you have to use these abilities can, by extension, increase difficulty, but it can just as easily decrease the difficulty if the optimal strategy is the easiest strategy. I'll go into an example of that later. I just want to get a basic gist of what all these things are. The last thing is punishment. So punishment is when you fail, how much do you lose? How hard is it to just try again and again and again and again and learn and improve as you go through? Okay? Now, most of these things can coexist with difficulty. Most of the others, you can have bullshittery and difficulty at the same time. It's not fun because you have the difficult component that you're trying to deal with, and then you just die. And it's like, oh, well, great, now I have to restart. But unless it's paired with high punishment, it's not a huge deal, right? So then the other component of limiting of scope, you can limit the scope in such a way that the encounter becomes more difficult, okay? That is a thing that you can do. It's not fundamentally counter to actual difficulty. Punishment is directly counter to actual difficulty. An encounter cannot be simultaneously punishing and difficult. They cannot coexist because of the fact that the only way that something can be hard is if it requires practice to beat. If something can be completed in one try, it's not hard. Okay, that's not the definition of hard. It's easy if you can complete it in one try. So if you look at, so now I'm going to start getting into examples because I've now covered the core concepts that I'm going to be discussing. So if you look at a game like Super Meat Boy is able to be extraordinarily, just horrifically difficult and have these incredibly hard encounters that require strategy, tactics, and incredible control of your character and your physical requirements. Has all of this in these very tightly condensed levels where if you die, you only lose a maximum of like 20 seconds of your life. Okay? You can constantly get new iterations, and because of that, the difficulty can be very ludicrously difficult. The polar opposite of that is a game like Diablo. Okay, in the Diablo on hardcore difficulty, or not hardcore difficulty, but the hardcore setting, if you die, you lose your character. And we're talking about losing potentially like hundreds and hundreds of hours of progress because of a death. It is a very big deal to die in Diablo, okay? And that kind of punishment makes it so that you cannot have the game be hard. You cannot do anything hard in Diablo on hardcore mode. If you play the game on normal mode, you will not play as safe. You will take encounters that you might die on. You'll try to fight bosses before you're necessarily ready. You'll try to do things, you'll push your boundaries, and you will improve as a player as a result. When you're playing on hardcore, you don't improve because you can only take easy fights. You can't do any risks. You have to play it safe all the time. And because you have to play it safe all the time, that means you're never really getting any better. You're never really doing anything interesting. All you're doing is easy stuff. Everything is easy because if it was hard, you would be dying. And if you die, you lose your character. So punishment and difficulty are antithetical to each other. They cannot coexist. So I think that that's important because a lot of times people talk about something being hard because it's punishing, and that's simply not the case. Just because something's punishing does not make it hard. And in fact, just about everything that it... Sorry, this is weird. Whatever, I'll leave it alone. Just because... So, the fact that it is punishing means that it is almost invariably not going to be difficult. Unless the game is expecting you to devote 20 years of your life to something, if it has high punishment, you'll never get good at it. Okay? You're never going to get good at something if you can't practice. And you can't practice with high punishment values. That's why when you're looking at World of Warcraft rating, take the wipe is such an important concept. Getting back in, not just waiting for reses, getting everyone back immediately upon a wipe to ensure that you can get as many attempts on the boss as possible. That's because the only way to do difficult things is to fail to do that difficult thing over and over and over again until you have mastered it. That's okay. So, good example of difficulty, Super Meat Boy. Good example of the opposite of difficulty is Diablo hardcore mode. Okay, so let's talk about the other two things. So bullshittery is stuff like anything in second edition Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, save or die effects are a great example of bullshittery, where it's just like, okay, well, the enemy managed to roll a natural 20, and so I'm dead. And that kind of stuff is usually damaging to the overall experience. I think that bullshittery, there's a reason that I'm calling it bullshittery and I don't have a more neutral tone for it, is because there's really no place for bullshittery. Punishment has a place. Punishment heightens tension. It makes you play sloppy because you're scared. It does things. It influences your emotions in positive ways. So some people like punishing stuff. I like playing Diablo on hardcore, right? I like doing Dark Souls. I like playing things that are punishing. But it's not the same thing as doing something that's hard, okay? I like to diversify my experience with things that are actually difficult, and then things that aren't difficult, they just hurt me more when I fail at them, right? There's a fundamental place for that. There's no place for bullshittery. Bullshittery is bullshit, okay? When the random number generator just decides that you fail the encounter, that's not fun. It's not fun. You don't learn anything. There's nothing interesting about that. And when you look at Infinity Engine games, that's the way most encounters play out. And when people try to increase the difficulty, they tend to do so in ways that just increase the bullshittery as opposed to increasing actual complication values, right? The more things that you add that have save or die effects, the more you have to reload to just defend against save or die. It's like, okay, well, I failed my save, so I have to reload now. That's not hard, and it's just frustrating and irritating. So when you're making content, it's important to understand that you have to think at all times, is there a way for the player to protect against this? Is there a way for the player to ensure by good, proper play that this mechanic does not kill them? Okay? And then we get into the limitations. So when I say, is there a way for the player to prevent this mechanic from coming into play and from killing them, right? That can take many forms. And when you're limiting player options by changing the way that they are able to interact with an encounter, it has consequences, right? And sometimes those consequences are good and sometimes they're bad. You'll note that I put limitations on myself all the time. That's my shtick. I tend to completely prevent myself from using consumables. I don't use summons. I don't use any of the things that would make trivializing content too easy. And that's the kind of thing where you increase the difficulty by limiting the scope of abilities to prevent the abilities that are clear outliers, are clearly going to make your life way too easy. Those kinds of abilities, take them out of the equation, and you're left with a limited scope of abilities that functions within a balanced framework. That's what that's about, okay? And so, for instance, if you take a boss and you make that boss arbitrarily immune to polymorph, arbitrarily immune to instant death effects, arbitrarily immune to crowd control effects, and like hard crowd controls. I'm talking about like hold person, right? They can't move, right? Save or die effects. If you make a boss immune to save or die effects, that increases the difficulty of the encounter because you can't just bullshit the boss, right? You can't pull bullshittery of your own against the boss to completely negate the fight. Whereas if you increase the other stats of the boss to a certain point while giving them a glaring weakness, it has the exact opposite effect. So if you take a boss and you give them overpowering damage, overpowering HP, overpowering amounts of everything, but you leave in the ability to turn them into a squirrel and instantly kill them, if you increase the other values by enough, eventually the only strategy available is to use your wand, turn it into a squirrel, and shoot it with an arrow to kill it instantly. And that's not hard. There's nothing difficult about that. So when you're increasing the values of creatures, you have to understand that there's difficult ways to do a fight, fundamentally, and there's easy ways to do a fight. And if what you're doing is making it so that the difficult ways of completing the encounter are fundamentally no longer feasible, you're actually reducing the difficulty of the encounter and basically negating a difficult encounter from the game by virtue of just making it so that you can only, the scope has been limited to using an overpowered tactic that is easy to use. Now, that isn't to say that limiting the scope to a singular tactic is always a bad thing. If you limit the scope all the way down to you have to do this extremely complicated, very difficult thing in order to beat this boss, sure. I mean, that can work, right? If you make it so that a boss needs you to, pair together a bunch of different abilities, use a bunch of different combinations in order to sort of weaken it down and do whatever, right? If you want to do an interesting and complicated boss like that, sure, go for it. But that's fundamentally at that point a puzzle game, And even then, it's like it's not super difficult if it doesn't leave room for you to iterate and do things within the scope of that. If you have to memorize a specific pattern and then implement that pattern, that you're not really learning anything there. That's not fun. But when you have to pair together abilities in interesting and creative ways, that gives you more compelling content. So anyway, I think that's probably all I need to say on this topic. Again, there's a place for limiting the scope of encounter. I think if you limit the scope too much, even if you're limiting it to a very difficult to implement um, thing, it really just is not pleasant. You can't limit too much, but some degree of limiting to cull out all of the like really outlier, bullshittery things that you can do to the boss or to an encounter rather that make it really easy. Go for it. Like that's fine. And leave those things in sometimes if you want, right? Make it so that not everything has to be hard, right? You can have the ability to make a fight that you can bypass by doing something easy, right? That's perfectly fine. But always make sure when you're sculpting your encounters that you don't prevent players from doing interesting things in favor of just turning the thing into a squirrel. Okay, so that's, I think, it. I mean, don't make things punishing if you want them to be hard, right? And always when if you're making hard content, this is super important actually. When you're making hard content, you have to optimize really, really well. The better you optimize your content, the better you optimize your code, the better you can get reloading done quickly, the faster a player can do the encounter, get back into it, say, I know what I'm going to do this time, and then they do that, and then they fail again. The faster that they can get those failures in, the more failures, and thus the more difficult the encounter can be. So this isn't just about like gameplay design of punishment in the sense of like actual deliberate design, but how quickly a reload happens makes a massive difference, right? That makes a huge difference. The fact that Super Meat Boy you get in there so quickly is so key. So don't waste the player's time. If you're going to make things hard, get them back in there as quickly as you can because it'll allow you to make harder content and the players will be satisfied with that. So thank you everyone for watching. It has been a pleasure to make this video for you today. And I hope it's been helpful and interesting for you. Later, folks.